All right, welcome everyone to week 3 of college composition. We are moving on into our second essay format, which is the narrative. So let's go ahead and get started. What to expect this week? Be sure to read page 155 to 167 in the Longman Writer. We will also have a discussion board this week, so be sure to respond to those questions and respond to at least 3 of your classmates' posts. We will have also our second quiz over list 2, and that is over page 6 through 9 in the vocabulary textbook. You can also find the actual list in assignments and quizzes under the week 3 folder. And be sure to keep in mind that our next essay is due by the end of week 4, the final draft of essay 2. So those are some things to expect. Now, let's talk about the narrative essay assignment that's coming up. Your job for this assignment is to write about a time when you were keenly aware of an injustice. You could write about an experience that maintained or shattered a childhood belief, or you could write about an occasion in which you volunteered or donated to something that you believed in. Of course, if you have any other ideas, you can obviously pitch those to me. I'm pretty open. These are kind of the category I'm looking for, but I'm pretty flexible. So if you have a different idea and you want to send it by me, just send me an email and we can talk about it. Of course, as always, our papers should be double spaced in Times New Roman 12-point font with 1-inch margins and contain that MLA formatted title page that I have posted to the announcements to show you how to do that. And of course, as always, you can only turn these in as rich text format documents, a Word document, or a new DocX document. And you will need to upload that to assignments and quizzes in the week 4 folder when that comes open. So what is a narrative? So a narrative essay is asking you to be observant with a memory of your own experiences. So it's basically a story from your own life. It can be a reflection, an observation, or a personal experience, but it's something that is a story. Narrative is ultimately going to have the structure and content that a story would have. And usually it's told in first person, but it doesn't have to be. It's going to have a point. So you're sharing a story with a purpose in mind. You can hear baby in the background. It's going to have a beginning, and it's going to have a middle and an end. It's going to have a plot. It will have characters. It will have a setting, a climax, and an ending. And a narrative for this essay will be one particular story. However, it can have many different contexts. So you're going to have a point and purpose, which I've already offered some ideas. Now, thinking about back to that assignment detail, here I'll go back to that slide. So it says a time when you were keenly aware of an injustice. So I think about that. I'll have a story for you. So I had a student one year that we were in a very small school, and she happened to be the only non-white person in the high school, and it's a pretty tough position to be in, and in general. But in this particular story, she was told by one of her good friends, and it happened to be a boy that she might have been interested in, but you know how kids are. They're not going to tell their teacher this stuff. But he told her explicitly, "I will never date a black person." And I found that to be quite an injustice, and expressed myself accordingly to her, and then tried to then share with the students many different stories about racism and about acceptance and that kind of stuff. And so that would be an injustice in my point of view that I might share in a narrative story. An experience maintaining shattered childhood belief. This could be something like when you found out Santa Claus wasn't real. And if you thought that he was, and you just heard me say he's not, I'm sorry, I'm shattering your belief. But it could be as simple as Santa Claus story. It could be something deeper, but that's up to you. An occasion where you volunteered or donated something to something that you believed in. I remember living in Joplin during the infamous tornado in 2011, and it really hurt my daughter, my oldest daughter. She really has a hard time with tornadoes even now. But the cleanup of that event was, especially since I lived in Joplin at the time, was rather, it was compelling. So that might be something that I would write about. So I have, those are just some ideas of my own experience, but you could think about times when you were aware of an injustice. It could be a kid that was bullied at school. It could be you bullying a kid at school, and now you're looking back and going, wow, I shouldn't have done that. Whatever your idea is, that's kind of the purpose, the point and purpose that you're looking for. But it's going to be a particular story from your experience or from someone's experience that you know, but you're going to be able to tell and observe that experience through sensory details. You're definitely going to use those, but you're going to use a basic story plot line. So let's look at these elements in a narrative. One of them is going to be setting. It's going to have a setting, and the setting is a physical place where an event occurs. This is where sensory details will definitely come in handy, being able to explain the scene. The setting can also include not just visual details, but as we talked about with sensory writing, it can include all the five senses, being able to help your reader experience that place. A new thing that a narrative is going to have that a sensory essay doesn't have to have is a plot. And a plot is that, rise and decline of the action in a story. Now, a short narrative like what we're going to be writing, which is a little different. So a short narrative doesn't necessarily come to a clear close all the time. You might start in the middle of an action. Those things are very common in short works. But a plot is going to have some basic elements in it, and you can do that even in a short work. So it's going to have what's called the exposition. This is the beginning of the story, where you let the reader know what's going on. It could be in terms of sharing who the characters are, letting people know, the setting. So you're giving some sort of introductory element that lets the reader know where you're coming from. It doesn't have to be this story is about, and please don't write that this story is about, but it's going to introduce the action in some way. Then it's going to have a complication. So I would say almost every story is going to have some sort of conflict. And whether that's an internal conflict like an injustice that you noticed, or an external conflict like a tornado, it's going to have some sort of conflict in the story. And it will also have a climax. The climax is the crux of the story. It's when everything comes together into the big action of the story. Now, does it have to be a big action? It doesn't have to be big. It just needs to have some sort of climax, some sort of coming together, if you will. And then toward the end, the plot will have a resolution of some sort. Now, like I said, a short work like this may not have as specific of a resolution as you would have with a longer work, but it's where, okay, so you've dealt with the climax and it has come to a close. I guess we could say it that way. And a narrative is also going to have characters, whether that's just the narrator, the person telling the story, yourself, or it could have multiple characters. And this is also where point of view is established. And I already talked about where it can be first person, but that means point of view is who is telling the story and how is it being told. So this could be first person where you use I and me, and it's obviously you telling the story, but it also could be what's called third person perspective, and this is where we have an exterior narrator telling the story, and it's from the he, she kind of point of view rather than using I and me. And then we also have an interesting use of second person, which is where you use the you perspective, where you're always telling the audience what they're doing. So you're actually putting the audience in. That's a little harder to use, to be consistent using in a story, but it's definitely something you can do. And then there's nuances like third person omniscient, which means that the narrator is able to tell the story and tell the feelings of all the characters. So their thoughts and feelings are able to be expressed in the narration. You have third person limited omniscient, where you only have one character or two characters where you can tell the thoughts and feelings of them. And there's several nuances in that. But in terms of point of view for this assignment, I suggest trying out first person. I think that'll probably be the easiest, where you are the narrator and using I and me. So other things to consider with narrative. One thing you can do is what's called a flashback, and that's where you start in the present. So you're narrating with a present tense voice right now in the moment, and then you flash back to the past. So you're telling a story that happened in the past. And that's one thing that you can do. You also have a flash forward, where you start in the past and you move forward into the future in some way and tell a story. Also, keep in mind that I'd like to see sensory details and vivid, engaging language. So you're using the same skills that you developed for the first essay into this second paper as well. And the last thing to consider with narrative is dialogue. So dialogue is when you actually share what people say. So that's the he said, she said thing. And dialogue is really interesting because you get to know the voice of the characters in real time. And it also allows you to describe what they say and how they say it. So that's also something. Keep in mind, if you ever share what someone says, you need to put quotation marks around it as if you are actually quoting a person. So I wanted to share with you some different suggested readings for you outside of our textbooks. So I have a couple of links here, a few links. The first one is a link to a student writer. And this is for the Adroit Journal, which only publishes writers that are under the age of 21. So I have a link, and it's to a story called Brother Bones by Gary Garrison. You could jot that down and look at that later. This is a cool one to look at. I think it's interesting. It's written from the perspective of a sister meeting with her brother for the first time. So you might notice that it's not Gary's obvious experience, because at least he's not the sister, I would guess. But it is definitely a narrative form. It's in story, and it's an experience. So it's interesting. And the other thing that I liked about this is when you go to the link, you could actually hear Gary narrate the story. So there's a recording of him reading his own story aloud, which I think reading aloud gives a different perspective on the voice of a story. So that's something that you could check out. And I wanted to check out together here in this presentation Patchwork by Rachel Sudbeck. And this is for the Blue Route, which is an online magazine that publishes only undergrad students' work. So you guys who are taking college classes are what are considered undergraduates. So those are people that are in the first 4 years of college before getting their master's or their doctorate or something like that. So undergrad students only are allowed to publish in this online magazine, the Blue Route. So we're going to go to that in a second. But I also wanted to point out this website here at the bottom, and you can check this out. This gives several links to publications for young people, things that either they are geared toward young readers like yourselves, or they are published works by young people. So, and it varies in age from, college students down to even middle school students. So it's a wide variety of links available there. So I wanted to check out Rachel Sudbeck's story at the Blue Route, and then I'm going to just talk about it a little bit. So here we go. Patchwork by Rachel Sudbeck. My house is full of quilts. Go into any room and you'll find them draped across the back of a chair, bunched at the end of a bed, pinned to the walls of our den next to family portraits and a needlepoint map of the United States. I can go into that den and pull one off the haphazard pile at the end of the couch, a Halloween quilt with purple and black fabric, a Christmas quilt featuring the Grinch, his smirking face peppered into neatly stitched squares, alongside other prints that feature such adages as ho 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 and happy holidays, printed in friendly green swirls. There are other quilts, of course, featuring the more standard constructions, flying geese and North Star and so forth, all lovingly rendered in pale creams and browns, the nostalgic sepia tones of my mother's childhood. But they end up in other parts of the house. The friendlier, more modern quilts tend to gravitate into the family room. I always dig for a particular quilt, a happy image of a big-eyed frog on geometric lily pads, and above him tightly stitched dragonflies. Their wings are flaps of fabric sewn in such a way that they flutter off of the quilt's surface. This quilt is the plushest and largest, the best for wrapping myself up in and feeling the dragonfly wings rustle across the surface of my skin. If I bury myself underneath it, I can see the ceiling lamp through the fabric, burnishing the green hues a dim orange, creating constellations out of the minuscule holes made by the pounding of my mother's sewing machine. If I listen to the silence of the house, I can hear that sewing machine downstairs fervently chugging away at a new blanket, unneeded. But when my mom clears a space on the floor so that she can lay it out for everyone to admire, I will still think that there is a sort of magic to it. I will hold a place of honor on my mom's chair for a few weeks until she starts another, relegating this one to find a space in some empty corner of the house. Quilting is my mother's passion, her obsession, her compulsion. She calls it her stress relief, and indeed her output increases during times of turmoil. The move to Nebraska, my sister leaving for college, and the general everyday stresses of life are all marked by the number of quilts churned out of the basement, all of them hearkening back to simpler times. Christmases and childhoods reduced to geometric shapes, easily pinned and stitched. There's a sort of manic quality to it, to the hum of the sewing machine murmuring through our house. Sit on the stairs leading to the basement, and that hum is accentuated by Mom's record player, a Christmas gift to herself, which churns out crackling tunes from Mott, the Hoople, and Jethro Tull, the needle tracing out the contours of the record, the moaning voices of the singers rising and falling above the steady thud of the needle, puncturing fabric. This is preferable to when the needle stops, and I can sit on the stairs and listen to her sob, while the Who or the Beatles provide a scratchy backdrop. At these times, I wish that I could go down to her and wrap us both up into one of the quilts, huddle us together under the fabric the way she used to do for me when I cried, make a patchwork cocoon. Instead, I merely wait for the machine to whir back to life, for her to resume work on some new cowboy-printed piece of fabric. There are two quilts that my mother is proudest of, two that never got relegated to the end of the couch. These are the two that hung on the wall, although the central design of one of them also graces my mother's custom credit card. With most quilts, I only see the end product, but my family was treated to in-progress shots of these two. My mother would bring one up, shake it out, so we could all see what she's done so far, and beam at us. I don't know if any of us quite understood the significance of them. We had perhaps grown desensitized to the art of quilting. But even so, looking at the unfinished quilts, their blocks trailing off of each other like pixels, we would all nod and bug our eyes out and generally congratulate her. There was nothing else for it, really. When they were done, she laid them out side by side in the living room. They were clear companions, had the same color scheme, a sort of deep midnight blue offset by pale oranges and the occasional flash of dim green. The one I liked better, she nudged with her foot and said, obviously this one isn't the main attraction, but I wanted to do two quilts, so I put together this sort of similar one as well. It was like a large harvest moon to my eyes. The center was a pale orange circle made of 4 pie slices, each a subtly different shade or pattern. The background of each slice was a different array of blues radiating outward from its center. The other one she crouched down to smooth with her hands. I didn't understand it. It was a geometric quilt, but made of thin orange shapes that made me think of apple slices, all arranged in a circle, their ends meeting in the center of the quilt and radiating outward, thin green triangles and circles interspersed between them, everything stark against the deep blue background. The meeting point in the middle is what I suppose must have made it so difficult, but I couldn't see such a difference between this quilt and any other quilt my mom had stuffed into our house. Even so, she'd hang them up, moving aside pictures of our family, me and my siblings, my mother as a baby, my parents getting married, and some old sepia prints of more distant ancestors. These we spaced in a tighter clump along one side of a wall, and the moon quilt was hung alongside them. The apple slice quilt got its own wall, set beside the door. Finding that push pins weren't holding them in place, we instead used some of Mom's sewing pins, which are longer and drove the fabric deeper into the drywall. We all stood in the middle of the den to appraise them. Mom produced some magnifying glasses from various points in the house and handed them to us, encouraging us to examine the stitching more closely, the quilting that softly swirled along the inside of each block. I looked at it alongside my shoving siblings and soon grew bored, instead turning the magnifying glass to engorge other things, the crack in the wall, the sepia prints, my mother's face. I followed the lines of her, the constellations and patterns etched into her skin, threaded into the corner of her eyes and edges of her mouth. I followed their arrows to her hands, the radiating contours of her swollen knuckles gently fingering the fabric. So this is a narrative. It doesn't have the kind of plot that you would think of a story, but it definitely has a rising and falling action. We see the exposition at the beginning talking about the quilts and how they go around the house, what kind of quilts there are, and the connection that the writer has with the quilts. And then we start to see the rising action, sharing about listening to her mother either quilting in the basement or crying. And then we have the climax, which is really the introduction of these two specific quilts and the pride that her mother has with these two quilts and the love that she has with each of them. And then we have the resolution at the end when the narrator instead changes her focus to her mother specifically. And so we see that connection between the quilt and her mother and how those two intertwine, and how her mother tends to be in the background and she wishes she knew her better, like she would with that magnifying glass on the quilt. So I thought it was really poignant, and it had a lot of great visual descriptions. You see the apple slice quilt and the moon, and we see the different color descriptions and the very specific, the Grinch quilt. And we also hear the music, and I really liked that connection between the record player needle and then the sewing machine needle, and how we see how that quilting becomes music in the house. And the sounds details, although are not used as often in the story, they become very important. So I liked the way that this particular writer used sensory details to help tell her story. And like I said, I'd like you to check out Brother Bones if you can. And then there's these links that you can definitely check out other stories from the same publications if you'd like. So things to remember, be sure to read page 155 to 167 in the Longman Rider. Respond to the week 3 discussion board. I apologize, we don't have Word Power Made Easy. We have our other textbook, but we do have our quiz 2 over pages 6 through 9 in our vocabulary textbook. And our narrative essay will be due by September 13th, not 14th. I apologize for that misstep there. If you do have any questions, feel free to add to the discussion board those questions or send me an email. Otherwise, we will see you in class. Thanks so much, and have a great week.